All right, welcome to my super secret side channel that some of you know of. Talking again with Kevin Non-Tradicath, and it's going to be kind of just a casual conversation. That's why it's not really on either of our main channels. I think it's going to be fun. It's just almost going to be like you guys are a fly on the wall for a conversation. So I think it's going to be good. So
For the record, from
go
my
for it.
perspective, there's nothing casual about this. This is a ranked
Okay.
and competitive competition. So,
To the death.
yeah,
If we were in person, it would be to the death. But since over
it
the
would.
internet, we can't do that. So
Yes, yes.
um, so I'm curious to see how this goes because I feel like there's a possibility that we are in agreement and there's just like a semantic kind of thing. Or perhaps the anti-realist thing might just make it a little bit like we're kind of agreeing, but not really. But I want to see where this goes. The
I'm
presentation,
interested.
yeah. So the presentation, and maybe you can throw it up now, because this is something we talked about the last time when I was on your channel. It seemed like it was something we disagree with, but we didn't really dive into it. So there's a common idea in the, I guess, trans debate about whether sex is a bimodal distribution. And I've always, I guess, been critical of this, and I want to kind of maybe lay it out why I think so, and then give you an opportunity to either agree or say, here's why you're wrong, or whatever you want to do. All right, so bimodal distribution, I'm sure, I mean, you're an engineer, so you probably know a little bit about statistics, but generally, bimodal distributions are when there's two kind of distinct groups. So the example they gave here is like, exam scores, you're going to have the people who studied, then you have the people who didn't study, and the people who kind of maybe didn't study enough, whatever. But you see the two big groups are going to be the people who really study and the people who didn't study at all. As this relates to, and that's just kind of how it works, those two populations, you put them together, it kind of looks like two humps. As this relates to the question of sex is a little bit interesting. So we see a lot of bimodal distributions when we talk about either secondary sex characteristics or even things like height and weight, which I'm not quite sure if those count as sexual characteristics. But here's just like a perfect example. So if you take the weight just of the general adult population, you're going to see two humps, one for the average for females, one for the average for males. And this is it's perfectly valid to call this a bimodal distribution. Now, here's where I would say the quote problem comes in, is that people will say sex is a bimodal distribution, which I think is not quite the same thing. So people will this graph will come up a lot whenever I've had a lot of discussions with anonymous people, just like on Twitter and YouTube and stuff about this. This is a very common graphic that will be sent to me when they say, no, this is how sex works. Immediately, my alarm bells are going off because I have like a math background and I'm wondering, okay, so sex is the x-axis. What are these numbers referring to? What is going on here? So this is obviously a very simplified, just kind of something someone threw together. What I think maybe is what's going on is, so I think what people mean really is sexual characteristics are bimodal. So for example, if you were to put, so like this is a little bit more of a general graph. So it just says morphological traits. So you could put like hormones, let's say hormone levels, testosterone levels. You're going to see two humps. You put estrogen levels, you're going to see two humps. If you put something like chromosomes, I don't know if you'd really be able to graph that since it's kind of like, it's not really numerical. It's more of like categorical, I guess.
Right.
But it is true. Or if you do voice pitch, that's probably going to be bimodal. Stuff like that.
Density of fast twitch muscle fibers would be bimodal.
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
Like average running speed would be bimodal. There's like a ton of these bimodal things.
Yeah. So I think what people mean really is sexual characteristics are often bimodal in nature. And since sex classification is just the aggregate of all sexual characteristics, therefore sex as a category is bimodal. So it's really the second part that I'm disagreeing with, because I don't think that sex is simply the aggregate of all sexual characteristics. The reason for that is more of a, I guess, internal critique. So, and sorry, all of these graphs are very low quality for some reason. When I copy them from Google and I stretch them out, they look really bad.
I can read them.
So,
they're fine.
Yeah. So basically, if you were to take that to its proper conclusion, there would be, okay, we've got, I guess, like average males, and then you have hypermasculine males, and then you have kind of feminine males, then you have intersex, and you have masculine female. You kind of see where this goes. Now, this is also just assuming that you could really graph every sexual characteristic into like one sort of aggregate. I don't doubt that like statisticians would have some way to do that. I know there's things like, multi like eight dimensional graphs that you could do that you can't actually really visualize, but technically you could mathematically graph it. Then you'd have to weight it, and then standardize everything. I don't know. I'm not doubting that someone could do it. but let's even just say for the sake of argument, you could do that. This graph would make sense, and you could do this. What you would have to, the bullet, I guess you would have to bite is to say, well, these guys over here are like more male than this guy here. This guy here, which this guy here might just be a man who has a little bit lower testosterone, but otherwise is pretty average. He might be considered, less male or whatever. And of course, you could bite that bullet. And if someone does, then I guess I would just say fair enough. But I feel like most people intuitively are like, no, I don't think there's like a male. I don't think it's like this guy's more male than this guy. But I think you necessarily have to conclude that if you're going to say that sex is on a bimodal sort of spectrum. I have kind of thought about just like conceptually, is there such thing as like a categorical bimodal distribution? Like, does that exist? Like, I think if you were to just say, okay, there's male, there's female, and there's intersex, that's how it works. Maybe I don't know if that would be properly called bimodal. It's kind of above my pay grade. But yeah, sort of the critique there, just like, are we gonna say some people are more male than others? Are we gonna say intersex people are less or more male? And that's where it gets to the part where I should have put it in the wrong order, is intersex. So when you look up intersex, and if you trust Wikipedia, maybe you don't. But what's interesting is if you look up intersex on Wikipedia, you see that a lot of these intersex conditions are not, it's not like we don't know what sex they are. Like in this case, Klinefelter's, that only affects males. So every person with Klinefelter's is a male. And I don't think it would be proper either like from just like a human empathy perspective or from a scientific perspective to say like, if you're Klinefelter's, you're a little bit less male, but you're still kind of male. I think it's like, no, you are male. You just have XXY and you have these characteristics that are a little bit different than average. And you have, maybe these issues, or maybe you can't reproduce because of this, etc. The other thing that is interesting is that some of the conditions say none, which I thought was kind of interesting. So like, I guess these people are like genuinely just like, they don't have a sex, according to, if I'm reading this correctly, which, I think that's what it's saying. So this kind of leads into a separate topic. I guess it's related of like, are there more than two sexes? So I would say no, because I'm saying that not having a sex is not a third sex. It's just you don't have one of the two sexes. And similarly, if you're intersex, you're an intersex male. It's kind of like you're a specific type of male. Like it could be something like, you're a tall male. It's like, okay, that's not saying that you're like not male. It's just saying you're a certain type of male. Same with female. And of course, hermaphrodites, which that didn't really come up on this Wikipedia. It's still the jury's out if anyone has ever truly been a hermaphrodite in the human species. But in that case, you would genuinely be like, you are male and female, which again would not contradict the idea that there's only two sexes. It just means you could have both of those two sexes essentially. So I went all over the place, but I'm gonna see what you think, because I don't want this to be a presentation. I just wanted that to be kind of the starting point, and then we can go wherever you want to go.
Yeah, so I almost feel like you and I agree up until the last step. So virtually all, maybe not chromosomes, but virtually, like, putting chromosomes aside, the rest of the sex characteristics are all bimodal, right? Agreed. Cool. Chromosomes aren't like a distribution. Well, there's a distribution, but you just can't really graph it.
Yeah.
But not everyone is just XX or XY. There are people born with a single X chromosome. There's two X's and a Y. There's three X's. I'm probably missing a few others.
Oh, there's a lot. There's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
But so there's a distribution of those people. It's just kind of hard to put that on a graph because you're like, well, what exactly is the x-axis? We could make like a little pie, like, we could make a little distribution just, with individual points. Like a bar chart. But yeah, so we see all of that. And then you take a look at, so I should probably say something that also that I agree about. I haven't seen a attempt to like take all of those characteristics and then combine them into some kind of index, and then we can like graph that index. And if we did graph that index, we probably would see that bimodal distribution. So let's call it the Kevin index. This Kevin index says that 10% of the Kevin index is weighted by your chromosomes, and then another 10% of the index is weighted by your hormones and another 10%, whatever, that probably would be bimodal. And then we get to this weird thing where we have, if we do want to say that sex is bimodal, then we have some men who are more men than other men.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's, yes, Kevin, his testosterone is this high and he's XY, but there's this other man who's also XY, but his testosterone is higher. So is he more of a man than Kevin?
Right. Yeah.
And we have this this like intuition that that's not right. So we go ahead and we just kind of say, well, we're going to assume that's wrong. I'm kind of sitting here and I'm not biting the bullet saying that, no, it is right. That guy is more masculine than Kevin is, or more
Mm-hmm.
of a man than Kevin is. I'm just saying that I think that the whole category of male and female is one that we kind of impose upon nature.
Mm-hmm.
Nature makes like individuals, and most of those individuals fall into this bimodal structure. Well, no, we all fall into this bimodal structure, but most of us kind of fall neatly into one of the two humps.
Yeah.
But not all of us do. So it's useful for us to talk as if there's this real thing called sex. But it's not real. It's a category that we impose upon nature. And it's very useful. That's why we impose it upon nature. But it's not real in the same way that like it's not real in the same way that like positive and negative charges are real.
Mm-hmm.
You know. And because it's not real, I kind of just don't get all bent out of shape about it. I kind of say like, yeah, sex is a thing that we impose upon nature. Most of us fit into this bimodal distribution. So for ease of communicating, I just tell people I'm a male. I don't say, well, I have XY chromosomes and my testosterone when I measured it this morning was actually at this much. And like, no, I'm male. Like close enough, right?
I don't know what my chromosomes are. I don't know if you do.
I mean, no, actually, I don't either. Yeah, I've never gotten my genome sequenced.
Yeah.
But I assume I'm XY. And I feel pretty safe in that assumption too. Like,
Yeah. And I think that, okay. So I'll say three things. I'll just see if I can remember all three by the time I get to them. So the first one would just be, if you get super granular, you could say there are as many sexes as there are people, because no two people are going to have exactly the same amount. So you kind of have to make these boxes. And I guess my question to you would be like, from the anti-realist perspective, where it's like, okay, we're observing this and then we create the categories. Would you create more than two categories if you're like in charge? Do you think that makes sense to say like there's a third category called intersex? Or do you still say like, no, like Klinefelters, they should still be in the male, but with an asterisk or something? I don't know.
Good question. I guess I would do three, because I would say like, you either fall into the one hump, the other hump, or you don't fall into either hump. And then you're either a hypermasculine male, a hyperfeminine female, or you're somewhere in the middle and then you're intersex. But I'm not willing to like call those out as individual. I'm just going to say, male, female, other kind of probably. But even then what I say almost doesn't matter, because we've, if we've gotten to the point where we agree that like we are just coming up with categories, but they're not veridical. Like it's we're just kind of doing this for convenience. Then at that point, I'm kind of like, if you want to say that there's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, I don't really care. It's just, I mean, at some point it gets really inconvenient, and I'm like, okay, like let's let's tone it down, guys. But
So here's maybe a good challenge to that. If suppose you had someone who was, I don't know, I don't even know if this is necessarily possible, but maybe just humor me. There's a woman who's 6'3", very high testosterone, maybe has an intersex condition, I don't know, has enough of these oddities that she's like a little bit to the male side in terms of all those things, but then she gets pregnant, she has a kid. Do you think that we would like, you would bite the bullet and say like, well, she really fits in the male category overall, but pregnancy is just kind of like something, I don't know, like would that like trump it, or would you not see that as trumping? Because that's kind of what a lot of people would look to, is like, if you get pregnant, you're definitely a woman, or you're definitely female. I guess not woman, but female.
I mean, I guess I would almost say like, I don't know if it matters a whole lot how I would classify that person. Like, no matter how I classify them, they are still a person. Like, a person who gets pregnant is a person who gets pregnant. Also, a person with XY chromosomes is a person with XY chromosomes. Also, you know what I mean? Like, it's so then what Kevin thinks that they like, what made up category Kevin thinks that we should put this person in, is kind of like, well, who really cares what Kevin thinks? You know what I mean? But yeah, people who can get pregnant versus people who can't get pregnant is a very useful category and largely maps onto what we say when we say male and female. That's largely what we
Yeah,
mean.
and people would say like almost like fundamentally that's why we created these categories of female and male is like it kind of that's the ultimate thing is the reproduction. Even though a lot of people can't or never do have children, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I might disagree a little bit. I think that the ultimate reason why we did it is because it was convenient for us to do so.
Hmm.
Because there's a bunch of people, and I'm going to call them women. You and I know exactly what I'm talking about.
Hmm.
There's a bunch of women who are born infertile.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't think that we're like, oh, shoot, she's not fertile. What do we refer to her as? You know what I mean? I think it's like, no. She fits enough of the other categories that we're going to refer to her as a
Hmm.
woman. And I think that it's the combination of all the categories that have made it convenient for us to come up with those labels. Not
Okay.
just, you know what I mean?
So that's
That's
interesting that we both agree, okay, this is still definitely a female, but our reasoning is a little different. Yours is like because of all the other things she has, she's female, and mine is maybe it would be like, well, it's more maybe it's more like a cart and horse thing where it's like the fact that she is female is why she has all those categories versus
well,
the other way around, maybe.
let's be careful though, because you said like we both agree that she's definitely a female, and I don't know that that's quite right. I don't think that like male and female are real categories. Like I think that those are categories that we come up with. You know what I
Okay.
mean?
So okay, so maybe what you're really saying is what society considers female, they still fit that. Is that kind of or would you put it
Yeah,
differently? Yeah.
yeah. I mean, even more than that, like you know, a person who uh has a uterus is a person who has a uterus. You know,
Hmm.
kind of independent of what Kevin thinks about it.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but it's just that female doesn't only refer to people who have uteruses. Because there are, and you would agree with this, that there are women born without
Hmm.
uteruses.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and so for that reason, I argue that the male and female categories are superimposed by us humans on nature. Nature doesn't play by our rules as much as we would like to say that nature does. Um, it's real convenient for us to talk about everybody as if they fall into these two categories.
Hmm.
So by and large, we do. Um, but again, nature doesn't care for what's convenient and what's not.
Yeah. Okay, here's my last, I guess, pushback on this specific question. So let's say you are female, woman, you grow up normally, you get married, or let's just say you get married, you want to have kids, you find that you can't have kids, so you go to the doctor and you're like, doctor, what's wrong with me? And then he diagnoses you, and it's like, oh, you have XYZ condition, or I don't know if this is a thing to just like not have a womb, maybe I don't know. We'll just
Yeah.
assume that, yeah, like let's say, oh, you don't have a womb. Versus if a male comes to the doctor and says, doc, no matter how many times I have sex, I can't get pregnant. I don't think the doctor will or should have the same response in both cases. Because in one case, the doctor's like, what are you talking about? Of course you're not going to get pregnant. Where in the other case, like, okay, like there's something wrong here, but like, it seems like you should be able to, right?
Yeah, well, it seems that way to us,
Yeah.
right? Um, like nature doesn't care about our seemings. And
Hmm.
I actually thought that you were going somewhere different with this question. Um, I forget. There's this woman who comes up all the time in discussions like this, and I'm not well read in this area, so I don't
Hmm.
remember her name. But I want to say that she's in her 60s or 70s now or something. But in like the 90s, when like genome sequencing was kind of new and she was in her 30s or something, she was like trying to get pregnant with her husband. Um, and the doctors were doing all sorts of tests on her because she wasn't getting pregnant. And they first of all found out that she didn't have a uterus. And then they
Hmm.
also found like this vestigial testicles or something
Hmm.
like in her abdomen. And they found out that she had XY chromosomes.
Hmm.
And they're like, oh shoot, you're like kind of a guy, kind of. But
Hmm.
like she lived her whole life as
Hmm.
a woman and married a man, and like by all appearances, like if we didn't
Hmm.
have the technology that we have today, we never would have known. Um, and so I thought when you started your question with like
Okay.
let's
Yeah.
say that
No,
you were
that's
a woman
interesting
and you
too, though.
found
Yeah.
out,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. That's also an
um,
interesting thought experiment. Yeah.
yeah, and so for well, I guess for her specifically, I just kind of point to her and I'm like, yeah, like who really cares what I think she is? Like,
Sure.
she's a person who was born without a womb, and so she'll never get pregnant. And like our expectation might be that she'll get pregnant, but that's because she has like breast tissue, and she couldn't grow facial hair, and these secondary things that are like more obvious to us. That's what caused the expectation for us to think that she should be able to get pregnant. But it was like, her genetics determined that she would never be able to get pregnant. And so, like, what is she? Like, who cares? That's kind of
Yeah.
she's nothing, because none of us are anything, because it's a made up category that we superimpose upon nature. That's kind of my 2 cents.
Right. Gotcha.
I don't know if I answered your question though.
I think I get what you're saying. So I don't know if you want to move into gender, but the thing is, why I think this topic is interesting, because this is often a roadblock to even get to the gender discussion with a lot of people. Because if you try to say like, okay, is to be a woman, is it required to be a female? Then people will be like, well, what about intersex, or what about bimodal, or what about? And it's kind of seems like it's just like, it feels dishonest. I don't know if people are genuine. Like, I'm sure some people are, but a lot of people, it just feels like it's a way to divert the discussion to being like, well, there really is no such thing as female, therefore there's no objective way to know who's a man or woman. But I think even like under your worldview, where it's like, okay, these are made up categories, we can still say, okay, man latches on to the made up category of male, and woman latches on to the made up category of female. That's more of the interesting thing of like, okay, what is going on with the male woman that we're, I guess, experiencing in society today.
Yeah, so I guess just like an off the cuff thought is for me is I don't think a whole lot about gender, partially because I think that sex, like, I almost view sex as like a made up category about made up categories. You know what I mean? Like, I think that sex is like a made up category. And so if sex is a made up category and gender
is like one more removed
right,
from,
it's kind of like, what are we even talking about anymore? Like, I kind of think that it's all just kind of nonsense.
So this would be
sorry if that's rude to
people. No. I think this is interesting though, because sometimes people ask like, why is this so important to you? I think from the Christian or Catholic worldview, there's like a emphasis on roles of like men and women and mothers and fathers, and people can disagree with that, but then it's like, okay, from the secular point of view, these still matter, because otherwise people would not be going through such lengths to identify as a different gender. Like, obviously it matters to them too. And I'm sympathetic, of course, to like, yeah, like you should be able to live the way you want to live. Like, if you are male and everyone expects you to like football and you don't like football, like you shouldn't feel pressure. Like, I'm like that too. I'm not a super like sporty person. So like growing up, I was like,
the Super Bowl.
I watched it, but I also did not care about it. So
for the audience, we're recording this on Monday, the day after the Super Bowl. I didn't watch it.
So like I try to wonder what is the push for that, because when you talk to some people, it's like gender is just about like how you express yourself, how you want to dress, how you want to act, what things you're interested in, and that all like perfectly makes sense to me. Even if some things I may disagree with, like I don't think it's a good idea for a young boy to wear a dress, and like I'm sure you're going to disagree, and a lot of people disagree, but like I don't see something that I would like philosophically disagree with. Yeah, but it seems like people still say like, no, gender is important to the point that like there's like an ontological like I am a man even though I was born female.
Yeah. Couple thoughts. So I'm going to return to the kind of like the ontological piece but first I thought about this like little analogy. You know how like it actually means something to like, if you say that you're Catholic, but then like, all right, so there's this guy named Schmevin, and Schmevin tells you, yeah, man, I'm Catholic. I'm also an atheist. And I think that Jesus was like a Buddha figure or whatever. He was a cool dude, but definitely not God. And like the Pope doesn't have any real authority. He's just kind of like a cool guy to look up to or whatever. Like, you'd kind of be like, well, are you really Catholic then? And if somebody thinks that like Catholicism has this ontological, like if there is a fact, like if there's a fact of the matter about who is Catholic and who isn't, then sure. But if Catholic kind of just refers to like this group of people who are like, who identify as such, then maybe that guy is Catholic. And people, this doesn't come up all the time for Catholicism, but like for Judaism, like Judaism today seems to largely be a something that you're born into. And so atheist Jew is not necessarily the oxymoron that atheist Catholic seems to be at this moment in history
Right.
anyway. But I, so I also think that those labels are also kind of made up too.
Mhm.
I think that, and I think of gender as the same way. So
Mhm.
like, if somebody says that they're an atheist Jew, I'm like, all right, man, like, whatever, like, I don't care. To me, it might not make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah. And I can see why that wouldn't bother you in the sense like you do you, but like in terms of I guess the utility of communication, like if someone says I'm Catholic, you should want to know what that means without having to ask them like 20 more questions, right? Like in an ideal world
I
anyway.
agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, it becomes very like annoying and inconvenient when people start using words that
Mhm.
way. Um and yeah, that certainly happens in the gender movement. I'm gonna be
Mhm.
honest, I don't think it happens nearly as often as like some of the talking head conservative types would have you think. Um you listen to the Daily Wire and you think that like
Mhm.
literally everybody and their mothers are trans.
Right. No.
And I
Yeah.
don't know. I have one close trans friend, one,
Mhm.
and granted, I live in Kentucky, but
Mhm.
um and there's nothing ambiguous about my trans friend either. Like she's, very feminine presenting.
Mhm.
Because she's a trans woman, right? So in case I didn't say that. But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um uh yeah. And so I also think like how we use the term mother or mom, mother, whatever. And that term, like, it doesn't, like, you're not a real mom because you only adopted a kid and you didn't, like, conceive the child yourself. I mean, you do hear that, but not
Mhm.
frequently.
Mhm.
I kind of think of man and woman as kind of like mother, where it's like, yeah, back in the day, mother only meant biological mother back in the day.
Yeah.
Back in the day, man and woman only meant,
Yeah.
like XX chromosomes and XY chromosomes
Mhm.
and stuff.
Mhm.
Um, but I think of man and woman similarly today, where it's like adoptive mother and biological mother are two different aspects of that same word mother, and cis man and trans man are two different aspects of the same term man. I'm kind of like, yeah,
Yeah.
that's chill.
Yeah.
I'm with it.
That's a good example because I've thought a lot about that because I think it is a good thought provoking exercise of like, is an adoptive mother really a mother or are they like not really a mother? And intuitively we want to be like, no, of course they're a mother. It does get interesting because we still have to say there is something different about a biological mother versus an adoptive mother. Because like, if you ask this adopted kid like who's your biological mother versus who's your adoptive mother, you're gonna get a different answer. So it's like
Mm-hmm.
mother is being used in two different senses. And I think you could make a way for this to work in the gender discussion where you say there's a woman, and they kind of do this when they say cis woman and trans woman, but then
Mm-hmm.
it's like, okay, are they women in the same sense? A lot of them will really be like, yes, they are. Like it's
Right.
the same sense. And it's like, I don't think you can really say that. Like you have to say they're different sense and you have to be able to say like what is different about them.
And that's the ontological piece that you were
Yeah.
mentioning
Yeah.
earlier.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's where I get off the train. I
Mm-hmm.
think that there are a certain number of people um, who want to say that there is this ontological category of woman, and both cis women and trans women participate in this ontological reality of womanhood.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's actually, really don't mean to be disrespectful at all when I say this.
Mm-hmm.
And this is disrespectful towards Catholics, but I'm like, it's, let me spell the whole thing out. It's going to sound really blasphemous, but there was a paper written. I want to say it was at Xavier. It was like a PhD thesis.
Okay.
Um, and it was about uh, Aristotelian physics and modern gender theory. And they were talking about like maybe there is this real kind of, like a platonic womanhood, and maybe this universal is participated in by trans women, and there's like a transubstantiation that occurs. That's literally the word that this paper used. And I understand
Interesting.
that
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 And I'm not saying that to be like to be rude or anything,
Mm-hmm.
but there was this paper that was literally saying like, yeah, maybe they like transubstantiate, like the essence or the universal of like male has left the body, and now the substance of femaleness has like entered the body, and you know um
Mm-hmm.
and all I can say to that, man, is kind of like, I don't think that those things, I don't think the substances exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Right. Yeah.
I just reject the whole category altogether. So I don't think it's right to say
Yeah.
that you know, I reject all of that kind of.
Hmm.
It's like a double-edged blade for me
Hmm.
there. Yeah, I don't know. That was a lot. Let me kind of
Yeah,
be
and
quiet.
makes me think of there's actually a lot of. Here's the thing that again, this is, I do a lot of like kind of internal critiques of this movement, because there's actually like the question of, is a trans woman, were they always a woman, or did they at some point become a woman? And there's actually kind of a split on that. A lot of people say like, no, you always were, you just finally discovered you were a woman, versus no, it's the moment you declared it, or it's like the moment you start taking hormones or you get the surgery. And there's like all these different points you get to. Um, it seems like a lot of the self ID people will say that it's like, again, if they're going with the ontological, like you are a woman, they'll say it's like you kind of always were a woman, or they'll say like, your gender can kind of change over time. Uh, and then the other thing that people, I guess, are starting to say is like, if you get enough hormones and surgery, do you actually go to the other sex, or does your sex remain what you were born with forever? Like those are, and I'm sure again, if you're just talking about how you quantify everything, like I guess technically you could change sexes if you change enough of those things, and that's how you view it. Um, yeah, I think what's maybe interesting there too is like, because I think there's a conflict between self ID and then all these other characteristics. So like you could look at a trans woman and it could be an honestly like very progressive like trans affirming person could look at them and study them and look at all the wherever they lie in the bell curve for all these sexual characteristics or how they present or whatever, and be like, yeah, when I look at all this together, it really seems like you're more of a man, just like by every standard. But they identify as a woman. So what do you do? Do you just always fall back on the ID, or do you fall back on what makes most sense in the context of society? Like, are you living up to the role? And I feel like there's not really a good answer to that. At least it seems like self ID is the most popular, and that's kind of the one that can just be the most. It's like the most subjective, but also the most subjective at the same time. Because it's just like whatever they say goes. It's like there's your answer, but also like what is the underlying like driving force of that?
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think that there is an answer to that question
Hmm.
because I think that the categories are made up.
Hmm.
So, I mean, if the question is just like, what made up category should we put them in?
Hmm.
Should we let them put themselves into a category? Yeah, sure, that's fine. It's made up. I don't care. Um, but if you're no, Kevin, which do they really belong to? I'm going to say like, well, there is no fact of the matter here. Nobody belongs to any
Yeah.
nobody
Yeah.
belongs to either category because they're not real. Like
Hmm.
we're just imposing these categories onto nature. Um, I don't want to like leave this topic yet in case you
Hmm.
had more to say, but I have a question for you.
Okay.
But let me. Did you
The
want to
only
add anything?
the only last thing on that is the question of, is it the person that decides what category then, or the society? Even if there's no underlying truth, because there are certain things that I guess I should have come in with an example of where society imposes an arbitrary, label versus the person just choosing it, right?
Yeah. I guess I'm of two minds because there's like the convenience argument and like, if it's
Hmm.
about convenience, then like the rest of us should decide. But then I'm also of like the yeah, but let's not be jerks.
Yeah.
And then we should let them decide.
Hmm.
Um so I don't know which one is the right
Hmm.
answer.
Yeah.
Um I think that there can be different answers depending on different circumstances too. Like um
Maybe something like sports would be more like
yeah,
institutions would decide that versus the person.
right. The military might be like a really valid place. The
Hmm.
doctor's office is probably a pretty valid place where we like,
Yeah.
but then just in terms of how you go about life, like, I'm not going to be like an asshole and be like, misgendering people left and right just
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
because I have some strong commitment to the ontological reality of like,
Hmm.
no, I'm not going to do that.
Right. Right.
Um, but yeah, that's my two
Yeah.
cents.
Okay. Let's hear your question.
So this whole time I've been kind of talking about how I think that we superimpose the categories. Um, I don't know that I heard from you disagreement, but I also don't think that you agree. And the reason I'll say that is,
Hmm.
and you can tell me I'm totally wrong here.
Hmm.
Um, but I think about like what the faithful Catholic, the Orthodox
Hmm.
Catholic is like obligated to believe. And I don't know, I think about like, you know, man and woman, he created them. Oh, okay. There's your ontological categories or whatever. It looks like we're committed to this, to the ontological reality of these two categories. That's kind of how I've thought that the Orthodox faithful Catholic would need to think about things. Do they?
Yeah,
Do you?
I would say yes. There is a commitment to that. So ontologically, there is an underlying fact like you are male or female, or in some case you're neither or you're both, I guess.
Are you free to think that? Or do you think that everybody has to be male or female?
Sorry, what are you asking?
Like,
Are you
is the
asking
faith
does the church
is
allow a dissent from that? Is that what you're asking?
right? Yeah, like,
Okay.
can the faithful Catholic think that there are legitimate cases of intersex people who are neither male nor female?
I guess I'd say I would hope so. I don't think it's really been clarified. I try to think of why the church would object to that as a possibility. Especially since we see, apparently, according to Wikipedia anyway, there's examples of them. And the question of like male and female, they created them. Where do they fall in that? I don't know what the theological significance of that would be. But I don't think that very fact would be something that like the church would object to.
Okay.
Based on my hunch, anyway.
Okay.
So what I would say though is the church, I would say, firmly teaches the ontological aspect. There's the epistemological aspect of like, is this intersex person male or female? Maybe it's like not so clear, or I don't know. This kind of goes back, but like a lot of people bring up like, how do you know you're really female? Like, well, you can give birth, and well, what if this person can't give birth? Are they still female? Yeah, I think that's interesting because we would still say like, okay, the actual act of giving birth would be sufficient but not necessary. So you could, if you give birth, you're definitely female, but if you don't, that doesn't necessarily mean you're not female.
Not, yeah, right.
Yeah. And then it gets into, okay, how do you know if you're really female? And you can get into this discussion of like, gamete production, or like, okay, maybe you don't produce gametes, but you could still kind of look at this person. If you were, again, this is like more epistemological, but like if you were a biologist or a doctor or whatever, you could look at how their reproductive structure is set up and see like, okay, what does it seem like the body is trying to make, even if it's not actually succeeding. But what I think is interesting is that like people will bring this up and be like, well, this person doesn't have any eggs, so how do you know they're female? And it's like, I want to ask, like, both of our grandmothers probably don't have any eggs if they're even alive, but I don't think either of us would say like our grandmother's currently not female. So it's like there's this agreement of like, I don't know, it's almost like we know, even though the fundamental like definition doesn't really apply. And I don't know if there's a good way for me to like really defend that. I think this is like where it really gets like difficult, but I feel like it's one of these situations where like everyone kind of knows what we're trying to say and we're like agreeing, but it's just like we can't verbalize it. So it seems like it's a roadblock when it shouldn't be, I suppose.
Yeah. I think you're right there, where you're like, I don't think people generally do a good job verbalizing the thing. Bogardus, what's Dr. Bogardus?
Thomas or Tomas Bogardus. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I remember that he did a thing about how he thinks that like your sex is determined by teleology. So what you're ordered towards. And in my estimation, that's the best that I've ever gotten to, like an actual like, if we are going to have these ontological categories, what is it that determines which category you're in? It's your teleology. I just happen to think that teleology is not veridical.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. But if it were, that would be a really good way to like, to come up with these categories. Do you kind of agree with Dr. Bogardus there, that you think it is teleology?
Yeah, I would say I agree with him on probably most things. And yeah, that's the thing that makes the most sense. I've seen discussions he's had with anti-realists, and it just kind of doesn't go anywhere because they get to the point where it's like, what is the like proper function of a male or female, and it's like, what does proper mean? It's like, I don't know. I guess I like I feel like we both know, but we can't verbalize it. But yeah, I can see why that would be kind of where it ends for you. Like,
Yeah. I thought you were going to bring up his he did a debate with not Destiny but the other Destiny.
Vosh.
Vosh, thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember watching that, and Vosh was trying to do the anti-realist thing,
Hmm.
but then he started talking about how like water isn't water because they call it agua in Mexico
Yeah.
or something, and I was like, okay, all right.
That's a
Let's
classic.
yeah.
Classic.
But what like if I was having a conversation with I am having a conversation. I was gonna say if I was having a conversation with somebody like Bogardus, but you are
Mhm.
somebody like Bogardus.
Yeah,
So I'll have the conversation. No. But the way that I think about things too is that even the proper functioning is still a human uh expectation, and nature just
Mhm.
doesn't have these expectations.
Mhm.
Um like it seems weird to me to say that like the proper functioning of this body is to like conceive a child, but this body was born without a uterus. Like how is the
Mhm.
proper this body doesn't seem like, but it belongs to this ontological category of people who
Mhm.
are supposed to, and you're like, well, yeah, but this one wasn't, and like how are we kind of grouping them all together? Well, they have this similar estrogen levels, and you're like, okay, that's great, but I don't know, sometimes I think that I'm really like hard-headed, and I blame my engineering education on it, because like how empirical, like it's drilled into your head that you have to have like if you know in God we trust but all others must bring data kind of deal.
Mhm.
And so yeah, that's kind of how I think
Yeah.
about the whole teleological thing. It's like I don't know that I think that nature works that
Yeah.
way.
So if we went back to the example of like the female goes to the doctor, says for some reason I can't have kids, versus the male goes to the doctor and says I can't have kids. Would you say like in the ideal like anti-realist world where everyone's an anti-realist and there's no like emotional roadblocks, like both should be treated the same way in the sense of like both should be treated, this is a tragedy that you want to be pregnant but you can't, we should do whatever we can to try and make it happen, but ultimately we're limited by nature, you know?
In this anti-realist utopia, um, does everybody have perfect knowledge about everything?
Sure.
That in that case, I would say yes. I think that it is
Okay.
equally ridiculous, because
Hmm.
if you're somebody who's born with female reproductive organs and um the estrogen, but all, and you're born without a uterus, and you're born knowing that you don't have a uterus, and everyone knows that you don't have a uterus, and then you're like, why can't I get pregnant? I think everybody would be right to be like, because you
Hmm.
don't have a uterus. Like, sorry. And it's sad
Hmm.
that you don't and you want to, but like you've known this forever.
Hmm.
Um, and I think for the person born with like the male reproductive organs, if he was like, I can't get pregnant, everyone would be like, I know you don't have a
Mm,
uterus. So
I
in
see.
that world, I actually think that like it would be equally like we should be like,
You
duh,
you wouldn't view the female as like, oh, you have, a disorder, you have a, it's
exactly.
just like this is just fact
It's
of the
how it
matter
is.
kind of thing. Yeah.
So it's the fact
Yeah.
of the matter is that you don't have a uterus, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you've known this forever. Like, I think that the tragedy is the mismatch between your expectation of how reality is and how reality actually is. Like,
Mm,
sure, this person was born without a uterus, but like it would be really cold of us to be like, I know that you've wanted to be a mom forever, but you weren't born with a uterus and it sucks to suck. Like that would be
mhm.
like really cold
Yeah,
because
exactly.
she
Yeah, yeah.
thought that she had one. Um, but it's less cold to do that for somebody who clearly was not born with a uterus, because
Mhm.
you're like, No, you've known this whole
Yeah.
time, you know?
Okay.
Um,
Well, yeah, I honor you for the consistency because that's kind of what I think would have to follow under that, I guess, worldview or logic or whatever you want to call it.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. I think it would be kind of like, I don't know, if I like came to you all distraught that I cannot flap my wings and fly, I think you'd kind of be like, yeah, like you're a human, not a bird. Like
Mhm.
we can't do that. Um, and I think that that comes from like the expectation. Like we don't have the expectation that we can fly, but half of us, or yeah, you get
Mhm.
it. I
Yeah.
think that the expectation is where the tragedy is, or the mismatch
Yeah.
in the expectation.
And my mind was starting to go to the, I guess, gender dysphoria, but I think it's a little bit different than what we're talking about. that's not so much like, oh, well, in some ways it is. I think there are people who have, very severe gender dysphoria. It's like, no, it's not so much that like I feel like I should be able to do this. It's just like I want to be able to do this. And of course, as far as I know, technology, you can't really, a male who transitions still can't get pregnant. So it's not quite there. But I feel like males who have gender dysphoria, a lot of them probably are like, I really do wish I could be pregnant, because that's something that I, I guess I've, since I've been a child, that's something I've wanted to do, but I've always felt limited by it. Um, and I don't think I think what we were talking about earlier is a little bit more of like maybe a delusional thing, where it's like, why can't I flap my wings and fly, or why can't I get pregnant? Gender dysphoria is almost like, I wish that I could do this. I know that I can't, so I want to change as many things as I can to match that desire, even if I can't actually change certain things.
Yeah, I think that the dysphoria part of it, maybe we're smuggling in the assumption there that like, the person with dysphoria knows what their organs are. They just wish it weren't like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess if you don't mind going back to the kind of teleological thing,
Mm-hmm.
it's my turn to use the biting the bullet phrase.
Okay.
Do you, and you, if you disagree with my characterization of the question, please reframe it.
Okay.
But do you bite the bullet on these ontological categories and you just kind of say like, yeah, I think that teleology is veridical, and I think that these ontological categories are determined by teleology?
As it relates to being male or female, yes. With, of course, caveat, you could be both or you could be neither. Yeah.
And like in terms of like the belief that teleology is veridical, is that something that's kind of just like a like an intuition maybe? Because it almost seems like by nature it can't have empirical evidence, right?
Right. It's either an intuition, or it could just be the fact that I've always been Catholic, I've been raised Catholic. That's just the way I think. Yeah, but the like very like the fundamental, like, how do you really describe or defend teleology? I've tried to think about it through my head, and I don't know really how to do it. I think it is something that I don't know. Yeah, I think it's difficult to describe, and maybe it is just an intuition at the end of the day. That could be it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, let me kind of defend you for a second, because I think that it's an intuition. I mean, like, Aristotle came up with this stuff like 2,500 years ago. Like,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
so it seems to be like an intuition that has been, like, at the very least, part of our cultural milieu for the last 2,500 years. Yeah. And so, like, it's a very deep seated intuition. Uh,
Mhm.
so, like, I don't think that people are crazy
Right.
for
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
believing in teleology. Um, I do think that it's something that, upon further reflection, like, once you realize that there's like no empirical way to verify it, I think it warrants returning to the intuition. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But again, if people are just like, no, the intuition is so strong that like I can't not, okay,
Yeah.
carry on.
I think it's probably so much of the morality thing, where it's like we all have this intuition X, Y, and Z is wrong, but we can't empirically prove that. So we all still might agree, don't do that, but one side is saying like, no, there's like an underlying truth. The other one is saying, no, there isn't. One is appealing, I guess, to the lack of empirical evidence. The other one just saying like, it's our intuition. We all agree. Why don't we just agree that it exists as well? Is
Yeah.
maybe the way they would put it. Yeah.
And sometimes I feel like they're almost saying the same thing with like different semantics as well. You know what I mean? So
Yeah, potentially.
yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. And I think too that a lot of the gender conversation is the same thing in different language until we get to like the ontological underlying reality, because then there
Mm-hmm.
seems to be two distinct camps. But um yeah, yeah. I guess I can ask you one more question.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think, and if I characterize it wrong, correct me, but I think that these are roughly your views. Um, you do believe in the underlying ontological reality. Um, this is something that's mostly an intuition, but with the acknowledgement that it's simply beyond the empirical. There's no hope of empirical verification
Mm-hmm.
because it isn't the kind of thing that can be You'll never find this under a microscope.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's where we find ourselves, and now we find ourselves running a government or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me like somebody who holds this position on an intuition is probably somebody who holds it tentatively, not nearly as strongly as they might hold something like, the Earth is round or something that you can empirically verify.
Mm-hmm.
That gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if that's the case, does it behoove somebody to be kind of a little bit more lax in the laws surrounding this? So I'm thinking here of all the Catholic monarchists who, yearn for King Louis the 17th or whatever of the United States to come
Mm-hmm.
and make it illegal to, whatever. It seems to me like the person who has reached the point of, yes, it's not empirically verifiable. I'm still going to believe it because I've got this intuition and because it's in the
Mm-hmm.
Bible or whatever. It seems to me like that person should probably be a little bit more hesitant to make laws that are restricting other people's freedoms,
Mm-hmm.
if you know what I mean.
Okay. Well, one thing I guess I would modify. So on the empirical part, I would say there still is empirical verification in the sense that, like what I said earlier, if you produce sperm that is a sufficient condition, like you are definitely male, and that I would say that's an empirical thing you can verify. It's the question of when we get to these ambiguous cases, not even ambiguous, but they're just like cases where it's like it's not as straightforward as just what gamete do you have right now. That's when you have to appeal to teleology. Like I think in the vast majority of cases, you could empirically verify it. But then when it's like you get to the heart of the matter, like what does it actually mean? That's when you kind of so that would be the only caveat I would put to that. But so is your question basically like what level of hesitancy should I have in enforcing that belief? Is that kind of what you're getting down to?
Yeah. Like,
Mm-hmm.
does the fact that and maybe I need to return to the empirical part too, because the question was kind of like, does the fact that this is an intuition and not something that can be validated empirically, does that lend itself towards a more liberal application of the law?
I see. Okay.
Yeah. And
Mm.
just to kind of return real quick to the empirical thing, I would say that empirical evidence of somebody producing sperm is empirical evidence of somebody producing sperm. It's not actually evidence of this ontological subcategory called maleness in which that person, you know what I mean? Um, but let me
Yeah.
hand the mic back over to you.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna have to think about that because I don't understand anti-realism enough to like really push you on it. But like, would you say if we use a different example of like seeing if someone has COVID, you take this DNA or it's not DNA, but whatever, you do this test to detect X, Y, and Z. There's an empirical process, but still, you having COVID is a something we make up, right? It's a category that we made up. You have COVID, you don't have COVID. Does that mean that testing for COVID is not empirical and it's ontological? Like, I guess that's kind of where I'm maybe getting confused.
So like if we did like the antibody test and we found that you have antibodies, then we could say, hey, you've got the COVID antibodies in you. And that's typically all that we mean when you say that you have COVID. We don't mean that you belong to this ontological category called like, people's people with COVIDness or so, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Nobody seems committed to the ontological reality of this category of people with COVID, you know? People seem to be
Mm.
totally fine to be anti-realist
Okay.
about people with COVID. Instead, there's just individuals who have the COVID in them. You know what I mean?
How do false positives and false negatives play into that though? As far as
Yeah.
you appear to don't have the antibodies, but maybe you actually do have it. We just don't know it. Is
Yeah.
that a good comeback to that, or is
Well,
it
so the
just another
anti-realist would be
layer?
happy. Yeah, the anti-realist would be
Mm-hmm.
happy to say something like, "Well, that's just a person who tested positive. Whether or not you legitimately have the virus in you is not technically determined yet, but the correlation is pretty high. So I feel confident enough
Mm-hmm.
telling you that you have it. You should act like you have it,
Hmm.
even if the virus is already out of your system, or maybe you never had it in the first place, or
Right. Yeah.
whatever." But yeah, I think the important part there is that nobody seems committed to this category of like people with COVID being like this ontological category,
Hmm.
not in the same way that people are committed to male being this ontological category.
Okay. So if I took a more extreme position, I said like you currently have sperm in your body, you're male. If you currently have eggs in your body, you're female. And if you don't have either, then you're not male or female. Obviously, I don't know anyone who actually takes this. That could be something that you would say could be empirical because it would just
Yeah,
be like matter of
yeah,
fact. That's how you do the categories.
mhm,
So
yeah.
the critique has to do with the teleology that explains, kind of fills in the gaps. I guess that's where the critique comes in.
Precisely, yeah.
Okay,
The
I see what you're
critique,
saying. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. The critique comes in where what I see male and female as filling in the gaps where it's just humans trying to project uniformity where there actually is none, and not none, but um we're trying to make nature more neat than nature really is. Nature cares little for our categories.
Hmm.
um and I actually view pretty much this is going to sound so mean. I view pretty much all of scholasticism as us trying to project our categories onto nature.
Sure.
um
Yeah.
and kind of more antiquity, like Aristotle and all that stuff.
Hmm.
I view almost all of that as like a reification of language. um like we have these words, and so now we want to kind of make nature match our words, when nature cares little for our words. Nature
Hmm.
is how nature is. And I think that modern science has realized that who cares about our words, you know
Hmm.
um but I think science 1,000 years ago, or not even science 700 years ago and earlier and all that,
Hmm.
cared a lot about words. That's
Yeah.
neither here nor there.
Yeah. I gotcha. So the question you're asking, getting back to it, was about like, how does this play into maybe like society, public
Policy,
policy?
yeah.
So here's a really good example that might actually be common ground. So I'm almost certain it'll be common ground, and I'm sure I'll get heat for this, but the bathroom debate, I don't think it's a good idea to make bathrooms strictly ontological, like male female. Um, People bring up the classic examples. So Buck Angel and Blair White, you know who those two people are.
Yeah.
If Buck
If
Angel
Buck
comes
Angel,
into the restroom,
I would drag Buck Angel out of that bathroom and be like,
yeah,
what the hell are you doing?
exactly. And so me, even though I personally believe Buck Angel is a female and therefore a woman, I think Buck Angel should use the men's bathroom because I think that's one, just from like a, yeah, public policy and like, just common sense perspective, that's probably the best thing to do. Because some people are, and this is what I like about Bogartis, is that he is very good at like kind of getting into the nuance. Because a lot of people will just be like, have a penis, you go to the men's restroom. It's like, it's just
That's
how it
right.
is. And it's like, it's not that simple, because if we follow that logic, Buck Angel is going to the women's restroom. And is that really what you want? Because you always talk about like, you don't want a little girl, your little daughter, to see that in the restroom. It's like, that's what you're going to get. Um, and I just also find the bathroom debate kind of a nothing burger, because people also talk about like, oh, I don't want, women will say like, I don't want to see, genitalia, male genitalia in the bathroom. And it's like, I've never seen male genitalia in a bathroom. I don't know if you
Me
have.
neither.
Like it,
Yeah.
like it doesn't really happen. Now, if you are some sort of male sexual predator, or a pervert who wants to go expose yourself in the bathroom, what you're essentially saying is like, I don't want you doing that with my young daughter. I want you to do it with my young son instead. It's like
That's awful.
that isn't like, if you say go, you have to go to the men's room. It's like, how is that any better? And like, there could be a level of like, okay, because men are built bigger and stronger, if something like that were to happen, they could physically defend themselves for an assault. I could see, um, but yeah, I feel like that's an instance where it's like, okay, my strict belief and the public policy don't align, because I don't think a strict application of my belief on that is really doing any good. And then of course, like something like sports would be totally different. I think there'd be very much an emphasis on your biological sex. Although I can imagine some extreme cases where you would allow someone of the other sex to compete. I mean, maybe if you really start taking hormones at like age 5, which I would be against, but if you were doing that and then you like pretty much skipped male puberty altogether, I don't
I
see the big issue. I don't think you would see these stories of like, trans women dominating in sports, because it shouldn't happen if that's the way it happens, right?
and I also imagine too that it is sport dependent, because I can
Yeah.
imagine
Oh
that
yeah.
there
Oh
are
yeah. Yeah.
like I think about like curling, like the Olympic winter sport, where
Hmm.
like I know that there's a certain amount of strength to push the stone on the ice. Um,
Hmm.
but
it's not about who pushes it the farthest for curling, right? It's about
no, exactly.
accuracy, right? So it's
Right.
yeah,
So I'm not sure that there's like a huge gender disparity
yeah.
between. So in fact, I have friends who live up in Wisconsin,
Hmm.
which is essentially the Canada of the United States, and so they're part of a curling league, and so they play curling games like 3 nights a week or whatever. And men and women play on the same teams all the time. Like it's although I think that they do also do like men's only leagues and women's only leagues,
Mm.
but I think that's more about like all the men are like really competitive with one another and the women are like just like not so it doesn't have to do with their skill. I think regardless, I could imagine too that it's sport dependent there.
Yeah, and I
But
think like
for something like
archery,
boxing, I'm like,
yeah, yeah, boxing
yeah.
or basketball. I think like
I think they need to be
archery,
very strict with
yeah, I think
like
like archery and shooting. I think there might be females do better on average. Um,
really
I
interesting. I did not know that.
I'll have to double check. I think one of those two at least, or maybe historical. I don't know. I'm pretty sure. Gymnastics, of course, that one's very
Makes
subjective as
sense.
far as like judging. Um,
Yeah.
my whole thing would just be like if you feel like there's not a real advantage, then they should just be all together. And some sports should
Yeah.
just be one league. But if you're going to say no, they should be able to go in the category they want, but we should still keep them separate. That's where I get like it seems like you're contradicting yourself.
I agree.
Yeah,
I say that also, and I should caveat that I literally didn't watch the Super Bowl. I know
yeah.
nothing about sports, so
And
me
it's funny
being here
because a
like
lot of the
abolish
people,
gendered in sports. It's
and I
like,
will
oh,
say it is really funny when the Daily Wire people will bring this up, but then they'll also make jokes about the WNBA, and it's like
I
it's funny because
know.
they'll be like, no one watches women's sports, but then of course they're appealing to like if my daughter wants to play basketball, I want to make sure she has an actual chance to make the team. I get that. Um, here's one more thing that's just kind of interesting. So there are, I guess it wouldn't be called sports, but maybe something like Jeopardy or chess. What's interesting about males and females, I don't know if you looked into this, but my understanding is that the average IQ of males and females are the same, but the standard deviation is different.
Yes, I have heard that.
So it's like the males are wider. So like all of the really dumb people are all male, and all the really smart people are also male.
Yeah.
So it's interesting when you look at that. It's like okay, like on average they're the same, but if you get to the hyper competitive, like all the top Jeopardy players are male, and it's not because men on average are smarter than females. It's just when you get to these very ends, like it's going to be all male. So some people ask like, why should you segregate chess from males and females? Like I think you could make an argument for that because if you want women to be able to make it into like a top category, that would be one potential reason why you would do that.
And I'm open to like art like I said, I know very little about sports and I have absolutely nothing on the line when it comes to sports. So when people are like, we should actually segregate what I'm like, okay, let's do it. I don't care. Like,
Mhm. Yeah, that's
so
fair.
if somebody wanted to say like, we should like, I don't know, is chess already segregated? If it's not, we should segregate chess by sex. I'm like, okay, if the data's
Yeah,
there, sure, I don't care.
yeah,
You know? Yeah, I'm not opposed to making, and I also imagine that you could probably segregate a game like chess by like your score or whatever, and then you wouldn't even have to segregate it by sex. You could just
kind of like how boxing does weight categories, something like that.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. Although I know that for boxing, like men have like a higher density of fast twitch muscle fibers than women do. So
Women have
like
higher body fat
yeah, so
proportion. Yeah,
even the same weight man
yeah,
versus
yeah, yeah. That's true.
yeah. So on that end, I just don't want people to get hurt. If that makes me a bad person for not wanting people to get hurt, then I'm sorry. But
Yeah,
yeah. But like I said, nobody should take my opinion on sports seriously because
yeah, yeah.
I don't know the first thing about sport ball. But
That's good. Yeah, I think it's interesting to get a different perspective because, like I said, it seems like a lot of people are the dominant view right now is like the ontological view on the other end of like you are a woman, so therefore you should always be in every situation you should be treated the same way as other women. So in some ways, the anti-realist position kind of works against both because it kind of looks at that. It's
yeah.
like that doesn't make sense either. So yeah, it's interesting to get your perspective on all this.
And I should add too that there are I almost said like tons. It's I'm not well read in this area, but
Mhm.
there are at least plenty, if not tons, of like trans activists who are gender abolitionists as well.
Mhm.
So I feel like that term is a lot more political. Gender
Mhm.
abolitionist, it's like a political term. I use anti-realist because I think it's more philosophical. But it's more or less the same position where we
Okay.
think that like it does none of it's really like, there's no facts of the matter, and it's all just kind of categories that we're imposing on nature.
But don't they also want to
Um,
get rid of the categories altogether? Isn't that their end goal, or am I misunderstanding?
I think some of them probably do.
Okay.
Which to me, I'm kind of like, well, they're useful, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't have a problem with us using the terms male and female because I do think that they're useful.
Useful in some
You know,
cases. Yeah. Yeah.
I think they're useful in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know if yeah, that might be one big difference, I guess, between like an abolitionist and an anti-realist. And I definitely consider myself anti-realist.
Mhm.
But again, not an expert on this stuff. And these opinions are not the opinions of actually, I'm not representing anybody except for me. So they are my opinions.
Exactly. Cool.
Cool,
Well,
man.
probably wrap it up there. Thanks for coming on, Kevin. If anyone watches this, I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to reach out. Kevin, you can be contacted. What's the best way to contact you?
Yeah, so you could find my YouTube channel. It's Kevin Non-Tradicath. And then if you go to my About page, you'll find my email address. And the email address is nontraditionalcatholic@gmail.com. So if you want to reach out to me and tell me all the reasons why I'm wrong, have at it. Also, I will post this video on my community tab just to let everybody
Oh,
know
cool. Yeah.
to
Get some
come on
traffic.
over
Yeah, I'll
check
probably
it
do the
out.
same.
Yeah. Cool.
Cool.
Cool. That way it's not lost.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Cool. All right, man.
All right.
It's
And
been
then if
fun.
you, cool.